From the largest mass execution in US history to collecting dead Japanese body parts, to torture programs so disturbing they'll haunt you in your sleep. These are the worst war crimes committed by US presidents. And some of these crimes are so horrific, you'll be wondering how they even got away with it. Like James Monroe, the guy who gave General Andrew Jackson the green light to chase Seminole Indians and runaway slaves into Spanish Florida. And at first glance, it might look like a messy border dispute. But then you remember, this is Andrew Jackson, a one-man wrecking crew. 'Cause he didn't just chase. Jackson torched villages, executed native leaders, and even worse. While he wasn't looking, his troops accidentally massacred the Chehaw, a peaceful Native American tribe they mistook for enemies. Yeah, not great. Even Jackson was shocked when he heard the news, so much so that he ordered the arrest of the militia leader behind the attack. However, the dude skipped town and disappeared. Sir, he went that way! Meanwhile, back in DC, President Monroe tried to walk a fine line. He didn't exactly endorse Jackson's chaos, but he did sign off on the broader invasion of Florida. 'Cause by 1819, the US ended up owning the state. Largely thanks to Andrew Jackson doing what Andrew Jackson does. And even though the term war crime didn't exist back then, massacring civilians on foreign soil? Yeah, that checks a lot of the boxes. But if you think Jackson's death toll stopped once he became president, think again. 'Cause in 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, a law that forced Native American tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole off their ancestral homelands. The plan was to relocate them west of the Mississippi River. And the result was the Trail of Tears, where thousands of men, women, and children were marched at gunpoint across hundreds of miles. Between the freezing temperatures, disease, and lack of food, it's estimated anywhere from 4,000 to 15,000 died along the way. But somehow, it gets even more twisted. 'Cause the Supreme Court already ruled that the Cherokee Nation had the legal right to stay on their land. But Jackson said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Sheesh! He just ignored the Supreme Court. And by modern standards, historians across the political spectrum agree on what this really was: ethnic cleansing. So, did Jackson's successor come in and put a stop to it? No, not even close. 'Cause Martin Van Buren picked up right where he left off, fully committed to enforcing the Indian removal policy, which led to another 4,000 Cherokee deaths. And at the same time, the Second Seminole War was raging in Florida, where US troops burned villages, killed civilians, and chased Seminole families through swamps for years. But here's the thing with Van Buren. He was more of a status quo guy than an ideological mastermind. He just kinda went with the flow. Either way, enforcement of ethnic cleansing is still, ethnic cleansing. But speaking of brutal crackdowns, this next president might catch some people off guard. 'Cause Abraham Lincoln authorized the largest mass execution in US history. Yeah, Honest Abe. It was 1862, and the US-Dakota War had broken out in Minnesota. Dakota warriors, pushed to the brink of starvation due to delayed food payments, began attacking settlements. And the bloodshed was staggering. They killed between 400 to 800 civilians and soldiers. No! Don't go toward the light! US soldiers were furious, so they quickly put hundreds of Dakota men on trial. And in the end, 303 were sentenced to death. But there was one big problem. The trials were a mess. Most had no legal representation, and some lasted just a few minutes long. So President Lincoln stepped in and personally reviewed the cases. And even though he reduced most of the sentences, Lincoln still approved the execution of 38 men. Those he believed had clear evidence linking them to murder. And the execution became a public spectacle. 'Cause all 38 men were hanged at once in front of a crowd of 4,000 people. Now, to be fair, Lincoln was under enormous political pressure from Minnesota settlers demanding justice. And he did cut down the number of executions from 303 to 38. Some historians argue that, in doing so, he saved lives. But others point out those trials weren't real trials. And by today's standards of due process, this would be considered a war crime. Kinda like what went down with Ulysses S. Grant, who rolled out what he called a peace policy toward Native Americans. But spoiler alert, it wasn't exactly peaceful. Cause in 1868, the US signed the Fort Laramie Treaty, which guaranteed the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills. But then gold was discovered there, and suddenly the treaty didn't seem so convenient. So Grant ripped up the deal and let miners flood in anyway. Sir, I don't think that's a great idea! That move sparked the Great Sioux War of 1876. Oh, and even before that war broke out, there was the Marias River Massacre in 1870, where US troops killed 173 Piegan Blackfeet, most of them women, children, and elderly. Grant didn't know about it until after the fact, but still. Sir, this is happening under your watch! Between the treaty violations, forced relocations, and civilian massacres, Grant's peace policy looked more like a war strategy. But then came Wounded Knee with President Benjamin Harrison, which is probably 10 times worse than anything Grant ever did. Cause in 1890, the Ghost Dance movement was spreading across the Lakota, a spiritual practice that the government feared might spark an uprising. So the 7th Cavalry moved in to disarm a band of Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek. And what happened next was a massacre. As soldiers were in the process of disarming the Lakota, a deaf man named Black Coyote hesitated to give up his rifle, and it accidentally discharged into the air. At almost the same moment, a few young Lakota warriors threw aside their blankets and fired back with concealed weapons. But this was obviously a deadly mistake, cause most of the Lakota were already disarmed. So it was open season, and between 150 and 300 Lakota were killed, many of them women and children, gunned down while fleeing. Benjamin Harrison called it a battle, but historians have consistently called it what it really was, a massacre. But it gets even crazier, cause 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their actions that day. Medals that, as of now, have still never been rescinded. Sheesh. It's one thing to commit a war crime and try to bury it, but to hand out medals afterward, that's a whole new kind of messed up. Kinda like William McKinley, who oversaw the Philippine-American War, a conflict so brutal it kinda makes me sick. Cause US forces set up concentration camps, yes, actual concentration camps, to separate Filipino fighters from civilians. And it resulted in US troops using water torture, disease killing over 11,000 Filipinos, and a US general issuing an unthinkable order: kill anyone over the age of 10. Over the age of 10! Estimates of Filipino deaths range from 200,000 to over 1 million, from combat, famine, and disease. And back home, anti-imperialists were furious. Even Mark Twain weighed in, torching the war in a series of scathing essays. But McKinley defended it all, calling it America's duty to uplift and civilize the islands. Yeah, that was the spin. And after McKinley's assassination, Teddy Roosevelt took over, and the conflict in the Philippines kept right on going. But in 1906, it reached a horrifying peak with the Monroe Crater Massacre, where US troops surrounded a group of Monroe villagers, including women and children who had taken shelter inside a volcanic crater, then opened fire. Between 800 and 1,000 people were killed. And Roosevelt's response? He praised the troops and buried reports that detailed just how bad the massacre really was. Sir, how could you? Teddy saw the Philippines as key to American greatness and framed the war as civilization triumphing over savagery. Back home, anti-imperialists were horrified And let's just say, under modern military law, there'd be some very uncomfortable questions about who gave the orders and why no one was ever held accountable. But speaking of accountability, did you know that Franklin Roosevelt was tied to one of the most disturbing war crimes in US history? Cause during World War II, some US troops engaged in a practice called trophy taking, which is when they took body parts of dead Japanese soldiers home as souvenirs. Gross! The practice became so widespread that a US congressman actually sent FDR a letter opener made from a Japanese soldier's arm bone as a gift. And FDR reportedly said, "This is the sort of gift I like to get," but later backtracked and ordered it be given a proper burial. The incident was widely reported in the press and used by Japanese propaganda to portray Americans as barbaric. And honestly, sir, that is the definition of barbaric. Kinda like Harry Truman and the atomic bombs. Well, actually, this one's a little more controversial. Cause to end World War II, Harry Truman ordered the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, resulting in 200,000 civilian deaths, radiation sickness, and an unfathomable amount of destruction. But here's the rub. The bombings were never officially classified as war crimes. Why not? Well, the US won the war, and in international law, that matters more than you'd think. Defenders argued it ended the war and saved more lives than an invasion would have cost, whereas critics called it genocidal. Either way, it's still a hot topic of debate. But one thing that's not up for debate is Truman during the Korean War, cause he ordered the carpet bombing of North Korean hydroelectric dams, which caused blackouts and killed an estimated 20% of the population. Now that might be borderline genocidal. But when Truman wasn't looking, there was the Nogi Run massacre, where US commanders feared that North Koreans would disguise themselves as South Korean refugees to slip through American lines. So American planes strafed the crowd with machine guns and rockets, forcing survivors into 2 nearby tunnels, where for the next 3 days, US troops fired into those tunnels, killing between 250 and 500 refugees. Horrific. And to be fair to Truman, there's no evidence he was ever personally made aware of the incident. Kinda like Lyndon Johnson and the My Lai massacre, one of the most infamous war crimes in US history. Cause during the Vietnam War, soldiers from Charlie Company have been taking heavy casualties, mines, booby traps, and sniper fire. Morale was at rock bottom. They were told the next village was a Viet Cong stronghold, but when they got there, they found nothing but unarmed civilians. And what followed was a brutal, hours-long massacre, where soldiers rounded up villagers and killed between 347 to 504 people. But thankfully, not everyone went along with it, cause helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson Jr. was so horrified by the massacre, he landed his chopper between US troops and fleeing civilians, threatened to fire on his own men if they didn't stop, and rescued around 10 villagers. Sir, you're a hero! Thompson reported the massacre up the chain, but the military buried it. So the news never reached President LBJ during his term. On the flip side, it did reach this next president, Richard Nixon, who inherited Vietnam and launched Operation Menu, a secret bombing campaign in Cambodia, where B-52 Stratofortresses carpet-bombed Viet Cong supply routes. But there was just one problem. This was done without congressional authorization, and in a neutral country. Sir, you kinda need permission to do that. Estimates of Cambodian deaths range from 150,000 to 500,000. The destabilization it caused literally helped pave the way for the Khmer Rouge, whose genocide killed nearly 2 million more. The International Court of Justice later ruled related US actions illegal, but Nixon was never prosecuted, only because Watergate took him down first. But speaking of quick takedowns, the Gulf War is often called a clean, decisive war, right? Well, under George H.W. Bush, one of its darkest moments played out, when US forces bombed the Amiria shelter in Baghdad, killing 408 civilians. Intelligence claimed it was a military command center, but in reality, it was a civilian air raid shelter. Okay, boys, which one of you is taking responsibility for this? Bush stepped up and called it a tragic mistake, but also defended the strike as a legit military target that just went wrong. And while it was never officially labeled a war crime, plenty of human rights groups and legal scholars say, yeah, that definitely qualifies. Kinda like in 1998, when Bill Clinton ordered a Tomahawk missile strike on an Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Sudan. The US claimed it was producing chemical weapons for Al-Qaeda, but in reality, it produced about half of Sudan's medicine supply. Whoops! Wiping out the factory triggered nationwide medicine shortages, and in the years that followed, thousands of civilians died from treatable diseases. Clinton later blamed bad intel for the strike. But let's be honest, he knew Osama bin Laden was on the run, and in the back of his mind, he probably thought, close enough. But once George W. Bush took office, things spiraled out of control pretty fast. 'Cause after 9/11, Americans were furious, and the rulebook got tossed out the window. Bush authorized a set of so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, which gave the CIA free rein to do, well, whatever they wanted. We're talking waterboarding, sleep deprivation, rectal feeding, and perhaps the most disturbing example, Abu Ghraib, a prison complex west of Baghdad where CIA agents and US soldiers subjected detainees to beatings, stress positions, and bizarre psychological abuse that honestly feels straight out of a horror movie. The images still give me nightmares. But here's the thing. The world didn't even know until photos taken by the soldiers themselves were leaked to the public. And that's when the lid blew off. 'Cause international bodies, including the UN, classified the techniques as torture and in clear violation of the Geneva Conventions. Bush said he was deeply disgusted by the images, but stuck to the line that it was just a few bad apples. Sure thing, sir. I'm sure everyone totally bought that. But that's when Barack Obama came into office promising to close Guantanamo Bay and end the torture era once and for all. Woohoo! However, he ended up dramatically expanding the drone strike program instead. Sir! Strikes hit Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, and beyond, killing thousands, including an estimated 384 to 807 civilians, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. But the most controversial part was the use of signature strikes. This is when targets were selected based on behavior, not confirmed identity. Meaning if you were a military-age male in a strike zone, you could be classified as a combatant by default. Some called it reckless, others chalked it up to the fog of war. But Obama defended the program as precise and necessary. So yeah, no waterboarding. Just robot assassins from the sky. And look, this wasn't about saying America bad. I'm a bald eagle for crying out loud. I love America just as much as the next guy. But every nation has got its dark chapters. And what makes our country great isn't pretending those chapters don't exist, it's learning from them. But speaking of learning from history, this is 236 years of US president history explained in 22 minutes. From fake teeth to fake news, this is how 45 men built the richest and most powerful country in history, the United States of America.